The bitter smell of dead brine and dried fish scales clung to Silas like a shroud. He sat on a crumbling basalt rock near the northern edge of Magdala, where the Galilean shoreline curved into a narrow, desolate cove. The sun was punishing, yet Silas felt only cold. A profound, bone-deep frost that had set in months ago, the moment the fever took his daughter Miriam. He wasn't crying anymore. Crying required energy, and Silas had long since burned the last remnants of his reserves. What remained was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that settles in deep water, crushing sound and light beneath its weight. His eyes, once bright and quick, the eyes of the finest netcaster on the lake, were now dull, focused on the shifting gray-green surface of the Kinneret. This was the abyss he had stared into for weeks. It was an abyss not of water but of time. An endless, meaningless stretch of hours and days where the only constant was the absolute conviction that nothing would ever be good again. The hopelessness was not a feeling. It was a structure, a prison built piece by piece from failed harvests, crippling debt, the loss of his wife's loving hand, and the relentless, unforgiving reality of Roman taxes. Every prayer he had offered to the God of Abraham felt like a stone dropping into a well with no bottom. He had sold his boat, his tools, even the small, carved wooden whale his father had given him. He was a fisherman with no net, a husband with no home, a father with only ash and memory. He was nothing, and the world was fine with that fact. He ran his callous thumb over the leather cord tied around his wrist, a remnant of Miriam's tiny sandal. He had come here not to fish, not to rest, but to complete the final, merciful act of subtraction. He had rehearsed it 100 times in the sleepless dark, a long, slow walk into the deepest part of the cove, letting the cool silk of the water envelop him until the internal pressure finally matched the external. It would be quiet. It would be final. It would cure the unbearable pain of having to wake up and search for meaning in a landscape utterly devoid of it. He felt the pull now, a magnetic invitation from the depths. This moment, this decision, was the culmination of every broken promise, every cruel twist of fate, every unanswered cry. The world had told him he was disposable, and he was finally ready to agree. The weight of his own existence had become too great a burden for his shoulders, and the stillness of the water promised a peace that the bustling, cruel marketplace of humanity could never offer. He lifted himself slowly, his joints protesting with dry clicks, and began the slow, measured pace toward the water's edge, already tasting the salt and silt that would quiet the furious storm in his soul. Silas had only taken perhaps 6 steps when a sound pierced the dense fog of his self-pity. It wasn't the shriek of a gull or the lap of the water. It was the hum of distant, focused voices, hundreds of them, congregating far down the shoreline, closer to the city gates of Magdala. The sound irritated him, interrupting the sacred solitude of his planned oblivion. They were likely gathered for another traveling rabbi, another self-proclaimed prophet promising resurrection or liberation that never came, demanding belief in a world that clearly preferred suffering. Silas had seen them all, the frantic zealots promising revolution and delivering only mass executions, the austere Essenes promising purity and delivering only withdrawal, and the countless minor preachers who spoke eloquent words that dissolved the moment the listener had to pay their rent or bury their dead. This specific sound, however, was different. It wasn't the excited, feverish pitch of political unrest, nor was it the mournful chanting of traditional prayer. It was a wave of quiet, attentive focus, punctuated by a voice that carried astonishingly well across the water. A voice that was deep, resonant, and utterly lacking in the theatrical desperation Silas had come to associate with spiritual leaders. This voice was calm, certain, and seemed to speak less to the crowd and more through it, directly to the inner ear of anyone who truly listened. Silas stopped, not out of interest, but out of frustration. He just wanted the silence back. He wanted the permission to sink without background noise. He turned his head slightly, seeing the distant press of bodies, a dense mass of humanity stretching along the rocky beach, and in the middle, elevated perhaps on an overturned fishing vessel or a low ridge of rock, was the source of the voice. He couldn't make out the face, but the figure radiated an undeniable authority, an almost physical light that seemed to dim the harsh Galilean sun. Silas scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. Authority, he knew, was nothing but a temporary illusion in this broken world. Roman centurions held the true authority, backed by steel and the willingness to crucify anyone who challenged their claim. Yet, as the voice continued, weaving a strange, simple story about seeds falling on different soils, Silas felt an involuntary tension in his chest. It wasn't belief. It was pure, unadulterated skepticism battling a flicker of ancient curiosity. He knew the story. Every village elder told parables. But this man delivered it not as an intellectual exercise, but as a map to a hidden treasure. The cynical part of Silas whispered that this was just clever manipulation, a trick to distract the poor from their hunger. But the abandoned, hopeless part of him, the child who still wanted to believe in miracles, found the voice impossible to dismiss entirely. He stood frozen, 1 foot in the dry silt, 1 foot in the cooling water, suspended between his chosen death and this unnerving intrusion of life. The voice stopped abruptly, and a massive sigh of collective realization rose from the crowd, a sound like wind sweeping through a cypress grove. Then, to Silas's horror, the crowd began to thin, and the man who had been speaking turned his head slowly, scanning the perimeter. Silas, attempting to melt into the shadows of a nearby outcrop, knew instantly he had failed. The teacher was looking directly at him. The distance was immense. Hundreds of cubits separated them. Yet the gaze felt immediate, intimate, and entirely inescapable. This was the first step in the hidden plan to cure hopelessness, though Silas, drowning in his misery, had no framework yet to understand it. This was the step of recognition. Jesus didn't just see a vagrant fisherman. He saw Silas, the man who had been great, the man who was now broken, and crucially, the man who still possessed inviolable worth, irrespective of his suffering or failures. The gaze was not judgmental, which was Silas's immediate expectation. Silas expected to see pity, which was demeaning, or condemnation, which was deserved. Instead, the look was one of profound, searching acknowledgement. It sliced through the years of accumulated despair, the layers of self-loathing, the defenses built on cynicism, and went straight to the raw, wounded core of his soul. It was the look a father gives a lost son, or a shepherd gives a trapped lamb, a look that says, "I know exactly where you are, and I refuse to look away." Silas felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of panic, followed by a burning wave of shame. He instinctively hunched his shoulders, wanting to hide the threadbare tunic and the dirt streaked across his face. Why was this man staring? Did he know Silas's intentions? Did he know the depths of the black thoughts Silas harbored? The teacher began to descend from the small rise, walking not toward the busy path back to Magdala, but directly toward the deserted section of the shoreline where Silas stood. The crowd noticed the movement and parted respectfully, but they did not follow. The Son of Man walked alone, over the rough stones and dry weeds, heading straight for the man planning his own demise. Silas's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wanted to run, but his legs, paralyzed by weeks of inaction and the crushing weight of his despair, refused to obey. He was exposed, held captive by a gaze more powerful than any net he had ever cast. The teacher drew closer, until the sound of sand crunching under his sandals was the only sound in the universe. When Jesus finally stood perhaps 10 paces away, the intensity of the presence made the air itself seem heavy and viscous. Silas expected a rebuke for eavesdropping or a demand to move aside. Instead, Jesus simply stood, radiating patience, and the silence stretched, thick and challenging. Silas finally choked out a whisper, raw and defensive. "I meant no disrespect, Rabbi. I am leaving." But Jesus did not reply with words. He simply held the gaze, cementing the absolute truth of Silas's worth, regardless of his current state of decay. To understand the paralyzing grip that hopelessness had on Silas, one must understand the absolute completeness of his losses. It was not merely the loss of wealth, which was common enough under the Roman regime, but the systematic dismantling of his identity, stone by stone. Silas had been a man of the sea, his hands smelling perpetually of salt and fish, his back strong enough to haul the nets of a dozen men. His life had been hard, but honest, anchored by the rhythmic cycle of the lake. Then came the tax levy, a sudden, exorbitant demand from the Herodians that consumed his meager savings. He tried to fish harder, pushing himself to exhaustion, but the catch failed. That same season, a typhoid fever swept through the village, stealing his wife, Leah, and then, months later, his beloved Miriam. He sold his home to pay for their burial cloths, moving into a wretched shack near the docks. Finally, the boat, his faithful Tamar Dash, which had been passed down from his grandfather, was seized by a creditor, a wealthy merchant in Capernaum who cared nothing for the history or the lifeline the vessel represented. Silas often looked out at the boats sailing past and felt a hollow phantom ache in his palms, where the thick ropes used to run. His despair was not merely grief. It was the realization that he had played the game according to the rules of God and man. He had worked diligently, he had loved fiercely, he had remained faithful, and yet the universe had delivered only ruin. This sense of cosmic injustice was the deepest root of his hopelessness. It made prayer feel like a mockery, and belief feel like a foolish indulgence. He felt like a cast-off scrap of wood, tossed by a relentless storm, finding no harbor, no peace. The shame was suffocating. Shame that he had been unable to protect his family, shame that he had failed to uphold his patriarchal duties, and worst of all, shame that he had considered abandoning his life entirely, violating the deepest mandate of his faith. This crushing internal narrative, this relentless self-condemnation, was the poison that Jesus' gaze was slowly, steadily neutralizing. When you believe you are fundamentally tainted or cursed, the hope of redemption seems like a fantasy. Silas had convinced himself that he was a stain on the earth, fit only to be washed away by the tides. His hopelessness wasn't the temporary gloom of a bad day. It was the settled conviction that he was utterly, irretrievably broken, beyond the capacity of even divine repair. The fear that Jesus was about to confirm this final, terrible judgment was what kept him locked in place, trembling slightly beneath the sun, wishing only for the darkness he had been seeking. The silence finally broke, not with a pronouncement of judgment, but with an observation of startling accuracy. Jesus did not ask about the dead or the boat or the taxes. He asked about the future. "Silas of Magdala," the teacher said, his voice gentle but firm, "why do you seek to bury the gifts I have already given you?" Silas blinked, startled. He hadn't introduced himself. He felt a sudden, fierce anger flare up, an animalistic defense mechanism against intrusion. "Gifts?" he spat, the word tasting like ash. "What gifts, Rabbi? Do you call starvation a gift? Do you call loneliness a divine blessing? I have nothing left to bury but myself." Jesus took a step closer, reducing the distance between them until Silas could smell the dust and sweat of the road and the faint, clean scent of the lake water on the teacher's linen. Jesus' eyes, the color of warm, aged earth, held no reprimand. "I speak not of the nets or the fields, Silas, but the heart within the man. The heart that loved well, the spirit that endured, the hands that toiled until they bled. These are the sacred things, and they are not touched by Roman law or Galilean fevers. They are yours, and they remain whole." This profound reversal of values, stating that his internal suffering and perseverance were the assets, not the wealth or prosperity, was the second critical step in the plan. Redefinition of purpose. Hopelessness thrives when purpose is tied solely to external success or material stability. Jesus was shifting the foundation from shifting sand to bedrock. Silas stared, wrestling internally. The teacher's words were undeniably comforting, but they challenged the very framework of his reality. If his love and endurance were the true gifts, why did God allow them to be used up and exhausted in such futile struggles? Why did the righteous suffer equally with the wicked? Tell me, friend, if you have ever faced a moment where you felt like you did everything right, yet the world still collapsed around you. How did you reconcile your deep sense of injustice with the quiet voice urging you to continue? Share your struggle in the comments below, because it is in the sharing that the burden of such questions becomes lighter. The question hung in the air, connecting Silas's ancient despair to every modern soul feeling the strain of undeserved suffering. Jesus then looked away from Silas's face, toward the shoreline, where a small, rough cluster of children were trying to launch a makeshift raft of reeds. "I need water," Jesus stated simply, shifting the conversation entirely. "The sun is high, and my throat is dry. Fetch me a drink from that spring just beyond the olive trees. Will you do this for me?" It was the smallest, most insignificant request imaginable. It was step 2 made manifest. Jesus didn't demand belief, a confession, or a radical life change. He didn't promise an immediate miracle. He simply offered a small, immediate, and utterly achievable task, something that required simple movement and simple competency. This was the antidote to the paralysis of hopelessness, the injection of purpose through actionable, immediate service. Silas, expecting a complex theological debate, was stunned by the simplicity. It was physical. It was useful. It was the first time in months someone had asked him to do something that wasn't a punishment or a servitude. The sheer banality of the request, "Fetch water," snapped the tension in Silas's mind. He had been preparing for spiritual battle, for a fight over theology or fate, and instead he was handed a humble chore. His legs, which had been immovable moments before, now obeyed. The internal command to execute the task superseded the complex, paralyzing calculation of his despair. He found himself walking away from the fatal edge of the water and toward the path leading to the spring. As he walked, he noticed the sensation of his feet moving purposefully, the familiar crunch of gravel under his worn sandals. He wasn't walking toward death. He was walking toward a destination with a defined objective. The difference was startlingly profound. Hopelessness had fed on his inability to act, trapping him in endless loops of self-pity and rumination. The simple, small task shattered that cycle. It gave his mind a tangible focus. Find the spring, fill the leather pouch, return quickly. He passed the olive trees, the silver-green leaves shimmering in the heat, and found the spring bubbling coolly from a fissure in the rock face. As he knelt to scoop the water, the coolness against his hands was a physical shock, a wake-up call to the senses he had deliberately dulled. He was alive, and this immediate small act of service was proof of it. It wasn't about the water, it was about the act of doing dash. The teacher had recognized his worth, step 1, and then immediately given that worth a tangible function, step 2. Silas reflected that if Jesus had asked him to move a mountain or resurrect his dead wife, he would have instantly refused, overwhelmed by the impossibility. But water? He could do water. He filled the flask, secured the stopper, and turned back. He was still the same bankrupt, grieving man, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt marginally useful. When he returned, Jesus was sitting on the ground, sharing bread with the children who had been attempting to launch their raft. The crowd had dispersed entirely, leaving only the sound of the small waves. Silas knelt and offered the water. Jesus took a long, slow drink, his eyes meeting Silas's over the rim of the pouch. "Thank you, Silas," he said, the simple gratitude carrying more weight than any praise Silas had received in years. "This is the first of many drinks you will share. For now, we have work to do." The use of the word "we" was transformative. It dissolved the solitary confinement of Silas's despair and placed him into a community, a partnership, however temporary. He was no longer an isolated victim. He was an agent, a participant in the ongoing story. He felt a stirring in his chest, a hesitant, fragile sensation that he almost dared to call hope. Jesus then invited Silas to sit beside him, and they watched the afternoon sun reflect off the calm waters. The teacher didn't immediately launch into complex doctrine. Instead, he began to speak about the nature of a stone. He spoke of how a stone, buried deep in the earth, thinks its entire existence is defined by the dirt and the pressure surrounding it. It fears the chisel, it fears the light, because its stability is derived entirely from the darkness and the weight. But the true purpose of the stone, Jesus explained, is not to remain buried, but to be lifted, shaped, and placed as a cornerstone or a foundation for a structure meant to last eternally. The stone, in its raw, buried state, is still valuable, but its worth is realized only when it accepts the transformation and the vulnerability of being exposed. This quiet, parabolic teaching led directly to the final, necessary component of curing hopelessness: future certainty, the promise. Despair is fundamentally a failure of the imagination. It is the inability to envision a future state better than the present suffering. Jesus was providing that vision, linking Silas's pain not just to a useful present, step 2, but to an indestructible future. You believe your life is defined by what you have lost, Silas, Jesus murmured, his voice low and intimate. But your life is defined by what is waiting for you. The things you love, the fidelity, the hard work, the compassion you showed your wife and daughter, these are the materials of the kingdom that is coming. They do not perish. They are stored, secure in the Father's treasury, awaiting the day of final redemption. He spoke not of a distant, abstract afterlife, but of a guaranteed, imminent reversal of all injustice, a time when Miriam's fever would be accounted for, when Leah's kindness would be crowned, and when Silas's faithful toil would be rewarded not with perishable coin, but with eternal peace. Jesus explained that the suffering experienced now, the crushing weight of the present, was temporary. It was the refining fire, not the final destination. The true cure for hopelessness lies in knowing, deep in the marrow of one's being, that no matter how desolate the current landscape, the ultimate outcome is absolutely guaranteed, secured by an immutable promise. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was absolute certainty delivered by the authority of the Creator. Silas felt the immense, terrifying burden of having to make meaning out of chaos finally begin to lift. His job wasn't to understand why the fever came, but simply to endure, knowing the fever had an expiration date, and the love he had invested did not. He was being offered a divine contract, a promise of permanent stability and reconciliation. The conversation lasted until the shadows grew long and the air cooled. Jesus did not recruit Silas to become an apostle, nor did he offer to resurrect his finances. The immediate, practical application of the cure was to return Silas to his broken life, but armed with the 3 steps. Before departing, Jesus placed a firm, warm hand on Silas's shoulder. "Return to your life, Silas," he commanded gently. "Find the small tasks, the quiet service. See the worth in every soul you meet, for they too carry the precious stones. And remember the promise. Your labor, your grief, and your faithfulness are not wasted. They are the currency of a permanent kingdom." Silas watched the teacher walk away, heading toward the main road, disappearing quickly into the twilight. Silas remained sitting by the water, but the water no longer beckoned him to the abyss. It simply flowed, reflective and patient. The change within him was not a thunderclap miracle, but a subtle, profound realignment. He realized his hopelessness had been a form of ultimate selfishness, a total focus on his own pain and losses, blinding him to the ongoing needs of the world around him. The cure, the 3-step plan, demanded the opposite. See worth, self-compassion and acknowledgement. Act purposefully, service and competency. And trust the promise, future certainty. He stood up, his body feeling strangely lighter, energized not by physical sustenance, but by renewed direction. The debt remained, the shack was still small, and the graves were still empty, but Silas was no longer defined by these facts. He walked back towards Magdala, and his first act was not monumental, but small and practical. He passed an old, frail woman struggling to carry a heavy basket of dates. Without hesitation, Silas took the basket from her, not asking for payment or thanks, and carried it the rest of the way to her doorway. The simple weight of the basket on his shoulder felt good, right, the first piece of honest, purposeful effort he had undertaken in months. The woman's wrinkled, grateful smile was the only reward, and it was sufficient. He realized that the task was the reward, the action itself breaking the cycle of paralysis. The darkness had not entirely vanished, but now, he held a small, fierce lamp, lit by the quiet authority of the teacher. Days turned into weeks, and Silas continued his disciplined application of the 3-step plan. He couldn't fish without a boat, So he found work hauling supplies from the docks to the market stalls. The work was grueling, paid almost nothing, and often involved enduring the mocking stares of neighbors who remembered his former prestige. Yet Silas persisted. Every time the familiar, icy grip of hopelessness threatened to return, usually late at night when the silence magnified his grief, he would immediately engage step 2, action. If he couldn't sleep, he wouldn't lie there ruminating. He would rise and mend a neighbor's broken fence, or smooth the stones on the path, or fetch water for the elderly who could not reach the well. These were tasks that produced no monetary wealth, but they produced spiritual solvency. They forced his mind outward, breaking the inward spiraling vortex of self-pity. He began to apply step 1, the recognition of worth, to others. He noticed the weary eyes of the Roman tax collector, a man universally despised, and realized that man, too, was trapped in a crushing system, far from home, equally deserving of recognition, even if his job was despicable. He saw the worth, though he did not condone the action. This shift transformed his relationship with the world. He was no longer a victim railing against cruelty, but a man seeking small pockets of hidden value in a broken system. One afternoon, while hauling rough-cut timber, the rope snapped, and the heavy load tumbled down the embankment, crushing his right foot. The pain was immediate and excruciating. For a single, terrifying moment, the old despair flooded back, whispering, "See, you try, and the universe punishes you. This is the sign of your curse." But Silas countered the thought instantly, remembering step 3, the promise. This broken ankle was a temporary affliction. It was pain that would pass, not a permanent definition of his soul. He focused not on the injustice of the injury, but on the small task of bandaging the wound and seeking help. The old Silas would have abandoned the wood and himself to the pain. The new Silas found the strength to call for aid and ensure the valuable timber was not lost. The 3 steps were no longer a formula. They were an internalized discipline, a spiritual immune system against the contagion of despair. Silas continued to work in Magdala for over a year, his life slowly mending, not through sudden wealth or miraculous restoration, but through disciplined application of worth, action, and certainty. His reputation slowly shifted from the failed fisherman to the quiet man who always helps. He saved enough to rent a tiny room and even purchased a used, modest net. He began fishing again, not with the reckless ambition of his youth, but with a quiet, patient consistency. He knew the purpose of his life was no longer tied to the size of the catch, but to the dignity of the effort and the service he could render with his strength. One evening, Jesus returned to the area, gathering a large crowd by the water's edge. Silas, now standing among the crowd, felt a deep sense of humility and gratitude, no longer paralyzed by shame. He was one of the many listening intently. Jesus spoke that day about the importance of being ready, of keeping one's lamp trimmed and burning, even when the wait seemed endless. This teaching directly addressed the lingering threat of despair, the exhaustion that sets in when the promise seems deferred. Jesus emphasized that even in the darkest, most agonizing hours, the wait itself is productive, a period of deepening resilience and refining faith. He was giving Silas, and all those listening, the final spiritual instruction: how to maintain the cure. It was not enough to find hope once. One had to actively choose it daily, trimming the wick of faith with small acts of service, step 2, and constantly recalling the promised certainty, step 3. After the teaching, Jesus saw Silas and smiled, a gesture that conveyed volumes. He did not need to speak of the past. The evidence of the cure was visible in Silas's upright posture, his clear, focused eyes, and the quiet contentment that radiated from his being. The teacher understood that he had not given Silas fish or a boat, or even a sudden erasure of memory. He had given Silas the framework to rebuild his soul from the inside out, starting with the inviolable worth of his own existence. He had taught him how to live in a broken world without being broken by it. Jesus' gaze, once a confrontation, was now a shared moment of recognition between two individuals who understood the immense power held in small acts of purposeful movement and the steadfast trust in a final, guaranteed victory over despair. Silas knew he would face dark days again. Grief never truly disappears, but he was no longer afraid of the dark, because he knew exactly where to find the light, and he knew exactly what steps to take to keep the flame steady, even against the strongest wind of adversity. The 3 steps were his anchor, forever secured to the rock of the teacher's promise. He finally understood that the absence of despair was not the absence of suffering, but the presence of meaning, built step by step, day by day, until the structure of the soul was stronger than the storms of the world. He was cured not by magic, but by principle, and that, Silas realized, was the truest miracle of all, because it was a cure available to everyone, everywhere, in every age of despair. This hidden plan was not a secret, but a truth so simple it was often overlooked: to see, to act, to trust. And these 3 actions, done in sequence and sustained through diligence, truly did cure hopelessness forever, transforming the broken stone into a cornerstone of a kingdom unseen but absolutely certain to come. He was ready to live, ready to serve, ready to wait for the dawn. If this story touched your heart, and if you seek the strength to overcome your own moments of darkness and despair, please subscribe to Shoreline Parables. We are committed to sharing these timeless stories that heal the soul and illuminate the path forward. Thank you for watching, and may peace find you today.